It's my pleasure to be here tonight with you. I wish we had a happier topic. What I want to do is talk about the roots of Russia's war, what's been driving Russia's interest in Ukraine, and particularly, of course, what's prompted this invasion in February of 2022. So I'm going to pull up some slides here. And let's see where we're going to go. There we are. And we'll do slideshow. Maybe. Well, no. What I have to do is set the slideshow first. There we go. And then, is this going to work? Try it again.
Well, I have the slideshow on my other screen.
Yeah.
So okay. I am seeing what you're trying to put on the main screen.
Yeah, I was hoping, well, I have slide in some images, but it'll show them anyway. So this won't be too much of a problem. So this, of course, is a map of Ukraine. This is Crimea down here at the bottom. Before talking about Russia and the war, I want to give a little bit of background of context about the post-Soviet countries, just so we kind of situate ourselves a little bit. So one part of this background is, if I can do this too, I wanted to show where the post-Soviet countries stand. This is just before the pandemic, stand in terms of democracy. The countries are rated by international organizations. I've chosen Freedom House's ratings here. This is a scale from 0 to 100, where 100 is the most democratic, and I've rated them by regions of the post-Soviet area. And what I wanted to point out was the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, in green here, have been the champions of political transition in the post-Soviet space. At the other end of the spectrum are most of the Central Asian countries whose democracy scores are pretty low. Turkmenistan ranks among the top 5 most autocratic authoritarian countries in the world. Most of the others aren't far behind that. Ukraine, since its transition, since independence in the early 1990s, has been rated somewhere in the middle. So this is Ukraine as of 2019. It's held mostly competitive elections with some failures. It's mostly protected civil liberties with some failures. And so it falls in the middle of the spectrum here. One other thing I want to point out about the context has to do with the country's relative wealth. So this is the country's GDP per capita, also in 2019, with data from the World Bank. And here too, the Baltic countries have turned out to be the champions in terms of economic development, with the highest per capita GDPs. For the most part, the poorest post-Soviet countries are also in Central Asia, as are the most authoritarian, with a few exceptions for the countries that export oil and gas. I should have pointed out on the previous slide that Russia ranks among the most authoritarian countries as of 2019, relatively better in terms of its GDP per capita, thanks to the gods of oil and natural gas and their Russia's exports. So let me turn then to the question of what prompted the Russian invasion. So if you follow the media accounts about what's been going on with Russia and Ukraine, you know that NATO has played the central role in explanations for what's been driving Russia's actions. And NATO is undoubtedly important, but it's not clear that NATO membership or Russian concerns about it have actually driven this invasion at this time. And I say that for a couple of reasons. One is that Ukraine has been asking about a closer relationship with NATO since the early 2000s. since well before this current administration under President Zelensky. And so NATO has been on the agenda for over 2 decades. Second, and equally important, NATO does not admit countries that have an unresolved territorial issue, such as a secessionist movement. Ukraine does since 2014, and thanks to Russia. The occupation, takeover of Crimea, and the launching of war in Ukraine basically served as a de facto veto against NATO membership. So Russia already had a veto against Ukraine formally affiliating with NATO, formally acquiring membership. Well, if that's the case, then what I want to talk about is, well, what are some of the other key factors that have been prompting Russia's actions? And there are 3 things that I want to emphasize here. One is that there have been some long-term goals of the Putin administration focused on the other post-Soviet states and on Russia's place in the world that have driven this conflict. The second is more contemporary, and that is Russia has been facing some domestic challenges that have been exacerbated in the last few years. And Ukraine's government in the past year and a half, roughly, has adopted some policies that prompted real outrage in Moscow and the Kremlin. So I want to focus on those 3 things and elaborate a little bit further. So first, Russia's long-term goals. If we go back to the early Putin years, he took office at the very end of 1999 as interim president, pending a presidential election, then was elected for the first time in 2000. He has been pretty overt, stating the need to and the desire to play a central role in international politics, to restore Russia as a great power. So one example of that, of course, is Russian intervention in the conflict in Syria, starting in 2015, but there are many others. And here I've put up a picture of Syrian President Assad, President Putin, of course, and Turkey's President Erdogan, with Russia, with Putin in the middle. Beyond that, restoring Russia as a great power plays to a domestic audience, plays to the effort to build legitimacy for Putin's rule. Again, promoting the idea of Russia's greatness and that it's been denied its rightful place on the world stage. And beyond that, for Putin and for many now who hold high positions in Russian government, classical geopolitics also matters. That is the belief that countries with a large landmass, with a larger population and larger conventional military force, not to mention nuclear weapons, exert more global influence. So more territory, including places like Ukraine, Moldova, the Baltics, Central Asia, adds up, in this view, to greater international influence. Beyond that, another long-term goal is clearly Soviet-style hegemony over former Soviet countries, partly to counter US influence and the influence of the European Union and NATO, but also to counter Western-style liberal democracy in post-Soviet states. Here, this is a picture from the 1991 ceremony signing the official agreement that broke up the Soviet Union, called the Belovezha Accords. This is Russian President Yeltsin, Ukrainian President Kravchuk is here, and so on. The breakup of the Soviet Union has been characterized by President Putin as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And one of his stated aims is to sort of reassert influence over that territory, that span of territory, but also to counter Western liberal style democracy in post-Soviet states. So what does that mean more concretely? Why object to democracy? Well, from the Russian view, and this has been stated repeatedly by President Putin and others in his administration, Western style democracy for them just means chaos. it means disaster. Gorbachev's reforms, if you remember, liberalized. He lifted controls on people's ability to create voluntary organizations and to protest. Gorbachev lifted much of, not entirely, the government's censorship in the Soviet Union, censorship of media and publications. Well, for Putin and company, those reforms were a disaster. The economy collapsed by 1988, 1989, 1990. The Soviet Union disintegrated in 1991. So looking back on the Gorbachev era, this administration in Russia just sees total chaos and disaster. But they also look at the 1990s under a more liberal government under Boris Yeltsin from 1992 to 1999. And again, they see further economic collapse. The Russian economy contracted by something like 40% between 1989 and about 1993, 94. And the Russian government looks back on the 90s and sees efforts to break up the country of Russia. Chechnya seceded officially in 1991. Other regions, homelands to ethnic minorities, proclaimed themselves to be sovereign and declared that they were going to ignore Russian federal laws and so on, the Constitution. Well, Russia waged two wars to recapture Chechnya, first in 1994, 96, and then again 1999. So again, looking back on the experience of the 1990s, the current Russian government under Putin just sees disaster. Beyond that, democracy also seems to be a problem for this government because there have been popular protests against autocratic leaders in other post-Soviet states that have toppled pro-Russia allies. These have been called color revolutions. This is a picture, for example, from the color revolution in Ukraine in 2004. Why it was called the Orange Revolution? Because the color of the political opposition pro-EU candidates for president in Ukraine in 2004 had orange as in his campaign materials. And so people came out with their orange banners, their orange hats and scarves. Well, for Putin and company, these popular protests, people power revolutions calling for democracy are also a disaster because they've toppled what the Kremlin sees as legitimate leaders of the countries, pro-Russia allies. And indeed, former aides to President Putin has said that he's reacted to these protests that toppled leaders as an actual attack on Russia. And this happened twice in Ukraine, if you recall, once in 2004 over a tainted, rigged presidential election where people took to the street for months and forced a free election. And then again in 2014, when people took to the streets to protest against a president who had refused to sign an agreement with the EU and to become more European. Russian government objections to democracy relate in part to the experience under Gorbachev and Yeltsin, but also to the fact that if you let people out and they protest for democracy, they can take away leaders who have leaned toward the Kremlin. So question is, if we're talking about these long-term goals, how does Russia actually accomplish this or attempt to accomplish it? Well, there are different mechanisms of Russian influence that have been used certainly since Putin came to power. One is Russian involvement in elections. For example, back in 2004, the president of Ukraine, he's here, Leonid Kuchma, was outgoing. He reached a term limit of 2 terms. And so he cast around for a successor and he handpicked a successor named Viktor Yanukovych here on the right. Guess who here in the middle came to Ukraine repeatedly to appear with Yanukovych, sent campaign advisors to Ukraine to help Yanukovych's campaign, and was personally very much involved. by all accounts, again, of former advisors to Putin, Putin was and continues to be personally involved in the politics and what goes on in Ukraine, as, for example, in this case of the election. Unfortunately for Putin, in 2004, those protesters, the Orange Revolution protesters, stayed in the streets, encouraged Kuchma to eventually concede that the election hadn't gone quite according to the legitimate rules. And the outcome of the election was that Putin's handpicked successor here, Yanukovych, lost that year. He did come back later to win a later election. But for Putin, this was a pretty bitter loss. There are other ways that the Russian government gets involved in elections. For example, the Putin administration has created its own team of international election monitors from post-Soviet authoritarian countries, and they're noted for visiting in to witness the conduct of elections in other post-Soviet states. And they have never found any problems in any of those elections, including, for example, in Belarus, where the incumbent president has put his opponents in jail, had them beaten up, and more. So involvement in elections. Other strategies, mechanisms for promoting Russian influence, well, Russian media and language. In the Putin era, the Russian government has promoted an economic union that is described as a mirror image of the European Union. It's called the Eurasian Economic Union here. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. The idea is that this is a group of post-Soviet countries that eventually will have not just no trade barriers and no barriers for the free flow of labor, but eventually ought to have a common currency. Given that Russia is by far the dominant player, that common currency would be the Russian ruble. Russia also offers subsidy to governments, countries that are more favorable toward the Russian government, toward Putin. Big subsidies, as in literally half or a third as much of what the Russian government and its oil and gas companies charge to less friendly countries. There are business deals with local oligarchs, making local oligarchs, for example, in Ukraine, dependent for their wealth on Kremlin politics. And the Russian government has pursued something called passportization, handing out Russian citizenship to residents of other countries, as in Eastern Ukraine, as in disputed areas in some other post-Soviet countries. And the reason for that is that the Russian government can then claim that it is defending those folks because they're Russian citizens. It's defending them against the host country. So apart from the peaceful means, there are also coercive means, lots of those. Russia has mounted an information war, particularly against countries like Ukraine that have leaned west, or at least have had leaders at various times who've leaned west, looked for a closer relationship with the European Union, for example, or NATO. So information war in this sense means flooding social media and flooding news media sources with, where they have comment sections, with comments pointing to the fascist and Nazi governments in Ukraine, in the Baltics, in Moldova, and so on. There have been cyber attacks on governments, businesses, and infrastructure in other countries. And this is not limited to post-Soviet countries, but they've borne the brunt of these attacks. There have been financial pressure, such as cutoffs of energy supplies and Russian boycotts of products from various post-Soviet countries. And the Russians have used frozen conflicts and military force, as in a war with Georgia in 2008, an occupation, military occupation of 2 Georgian provinces. Of course, the Russian government annexed Crimea in 2014 and launched the war in eastern Ukraine back then too. So the mechanisms have been especially the coercive ones have been most intense, where 3 of the non-NATO countries have leaned west since 2000. As I mentioned, Georgia had a war in 2008, Russian occupation of 2 provinces, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Moldova had a war early on in the 1990s and has a breakaway region here along its eastern border. Russia has troops there and has supported and financed this breakaway region to this day. These are considered to be frozen conflicts. And Ukraine, of course, has had Crimea and East Ukraine. So these 3 have actually experienced the bulk of the coercive measures that the Russian government has undertaken. So that's the concern, Russian concern about exerting influence over other post-Soviet states and concern about keeping pro-Russian leaders in power. But my next question is, well, what are the conditions in Russia that have helped to push Russia toward this invasion now? And I think there are 2 things that we should focus on. 2 things that came up in Russia's most recent national security strategy statement that was published in July of 2021. And in that statement, one of the concerns that the government expressed was fear of literally, they used the phrase disappearance of the Russian people, basically decline of population, aging of population. There have been more deaths than live births in most years in Russia since 1990. So I have a figure here demonstrating that this is natural population growth, deaths versus live births, so it doesn't count immigration. And as you see, the natural population growth leveled off and declined. It bumped up slightly. This would be 2014, and that's the annexation of Crimea. But otherwise, there's been a problem. The Russian government has tried pronatalist policies, offering cash and other benefits to women to have children, more children. And it hasn't really generated the increase in births that the government was hoping for. The Russian government has also offered land and funding and jobs to ethnic Russians living in other post-Soviet countries who want to come and immigrate to Russia and settle in Russia. Unfortunately, that hasn't yielded very many takers, partly because the land and the jobs turn out to be in Siberia and out of the way places, not in the big cities that are most attractive to most people. So population decline has been one problem, and it received particular attention in the past year from the Russian government. Add to that, Russia has been experiencing economic stagnation since 2012. This is before the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Real incomes have actually gone down about 7% by the best estimates that I could find. And few Russian manufactured goods are competitive on world markets. This is very much like the Soviet Union back in the day, whose manufactured goods, machinery and consumer goods were a hard sell anywhere but in the captive markets of Eastern Europe. So President Putin has promoted the idea of this Eurasian Economic Union, which would effectively be a captive market because its policies so far have pretty much been dictated by the Russian government. The problem is only 4 other post-Soviet countries have joined with a total population of about 28 million. That's too small to absorb Russia's goods, and it's too small to really make have an economic impact on the Russian economy. So Russia needs a place like Ukraine, which at least at the outset of the war had 44 million people, and rich agricultural land, an industrial base, and so on, and an educated population. So long-term goals: exert influence over post-Soviet countries, keep pro-Russian leaders in power. Shorter term, help to deal with the problems facing Russian population and the economy. And then there's a third set of factors that I'd point to that have affected Russia's calculations about the invasion this year. And that has to do with Ukrainian government actions since about February of 2021. And that includes the administration under President Zelensky has been dismantling the peaceful mechanisms of influence that Russia had been using. For example, the Zelensky government adopted a new language law that mandates more use of Ukrainian rather than Russian. Reportedly, about 60% of the Ukrainian population can speak Russian still, and many still speak it at their jobs. Interestingly, that might be one reason why the Ukrainian forces have been relatively effective in figuring out what Russian forces are up to in Ukraine, because they can speak the language. But in any event, what I want to emphasize here is the Ukrainian government's actions that did not sit well in the Kremlin. New language law. In the Russian National Security Statement in July that I mentioned a little bit earlier, there's actually a reference to countries of the former Soviet Union discriminating against Russian speakers. The Ukrainian government closed 3 Russian language television stations in Ukraine in early 2021. And perhaps the biggest event from Putin's standpoint was that Zelensky's government has been tackling oligarchs and corruption in Ukraine, which is a big issue. So in early 2021, the Ukrainian government arrested and seized the assets of Putin's closest ally in Ukrainian politics. This is a man named Viktor Medvedchuk, who was head of the largest opposition party. Putin is his daughter's godfather. Since 2004. These two have been cooperating together since at least the early 2000s. And Medvedchuk has been identified repeatedly as Putin's sort of main conduit into high politics in Ukraine. Well, that stopped in 2021. And Putin reportedly was enraged about this action. One last thing, one other reason why the Russians would invade in 2022. And that has to do with the fact that there's been a water war going on actually since 2014 in this case. When the Russian government seized Crimea back in that 2014 effort, Ukraine cut off the source of most fresh water to this supplying Crimea. They dammed up the main river that provided fresh water. And Crimea has had a drought and water rationing for 2 years. For a region whose economy depends pretty substantially on tourism, on agriculture, lack of fresh water and drought is a severe problem. The Russian government had been trucking in bottled water. Obviously, that wasn't going to help the farmers. Ukrainian government actions in this water war helped to provoke a Russian response, a pretty intense Russian response. I should mention that within, I guess, 2 days after the Russian invasion, Russian forces dynamited the dam over that river and the water started flowing again to Crimea. And you will notice if you look at the movement of Russian troops along Ukraine's southern border, that they're intent on forming a land bridge between Crimea and the Russian mainland. There was no land connection. There still isn't one. Russia and Crimea had been separated by a narrow waterway, the Strait of Kerch, and President Putin had a bridge built over that strait, but it wasn't enough, obviously, to solve the water problems or other problems. Okay. One last thing, and then I will turn this over to our audience for questions. It's notable that the rest of the war, though, didn't go as planned. So Russian troops freed up the water supply, great, the second day. But Putin was told that it would be a short, easy victory. Reportedly, his intelligence services assured him that the Russian public, the Ukrainian public was dissatisfied with its government and would welcome Russian rule. Reportedly, the intelligence services actually did a survey in Ukraine in early February and came up with results showing that people were not happy with Zelensky, not happy with the Ukrainian government, and so on. Although, had they done a lot more survey research around the rest of the post-Soviet countries, they'd found that's a pretty standard set of responses. Doesn't necessarily mean that people want the Russian government to come in and take over. Well, what it means, though, in this case, is that Russian forces were prepared apparently for a few days. They weren't all prepared for a longer-term war. And we've seen the consequences, the failure to take Kiev and other failures as well. Let me stop here so that we can turn to questions. There are certainly other questions that I'd be happy to talk about. One is, it would be interesting to talk about how the Russian government has portrayed the conflict to its domestic audience. Second, the problems with Russian military planning and implementation, which seem to be pretty substantial, and the implications for other post-Soviet countries. So I will stop there and let me stop share and hand the floor back over to Helen.
Great, thank you so much. We have one question that came in via chat that I'll start with, and it's from Frank Ahern. He says, will the sanctions have any effect on the outcome of the war, and what additional sanctions might be effective?
On the outcome of the war, it depends on how long the war goes. The sanctions reportedly are having an effect on Russia's finances, there's no question. Although, because Russia is such a major supplier of oil and natural gas to the rest of the world, of whom some countries are not observing the sanctions, and because the price of oil, for example, is now, as of Monday, it was $112 a barrel, Russia is still earning quite a bit of money from its exports. So I think the answer depends on how long the war goes. The sanctions are having an impact, especially on inflation for Russian consumers. The cutoff of Western goods and Western companies is having an impact because I mentioned that Russia's domestic products aren't competitive on the world market. They're not competitive domestically either. Most manufactured goods that people buy come from overseas, are imports. So anything that makes those imports harder to get and more expensive hits people right in the pocketbook. Yeah, I wish I could give a better answer, but I think this is going to depend on the length of the war and where it is that Russia stops. The Russian government had been congratulating itself for basically surviving the last set of sanctions from 2014. And is determined to try and do that again.
We did have another question from Sarah Songer, who said, back to your chart where you showed how democratic certain nations were. She asked, how is democracy actually measured, that you could come up, how they came up with that chart?
In the case that I presented Freedom House's ratings, there are actually several organizations that do this, and they have a list of criteria. Are the elections free and fair? Was there competition? Were the candidates actually allowed access to the media, free access to campaign? Or, I mentioned the case of Belarus, were candidates who were challenging the incumbent beaten up, put in prison, denied opportunities to campaign? So free and fair elections. The ability to organize independently of the government, to set up, if you want to set up an organization for children's rights or an organization to monitor the rule of law, to what extent does the government in question allow that without restrictions, and so on. Freedom of religion. In the Freedom House case, they also include relative economic freedom from sort of government, intrusive government controls. So it's a long list. Freedom House employs coders and they look at the information for each of these countries each year. And they started this back in 1972. So it's one of the most comprehensive measures that we have, but there are others too.
We have a couple of other questions that have come in. One from Shaman that says, I've read that Putin feels religiously mandated as well and is supported by the Russian Orthodox Church. Can you speak at all to that?
Yeah. Well, there are two parts to that, I think. And I see someone else asked about Putin's, I guess, feelings about the commonality between Ukrainian and Russian culture. And there certainly is commonality. So the Russian Empire was converted to or the leadership was converted to Christianity in 988. And it was the Prince of Kiev who was the ruler at the time. And so the roots of Russian Orthodoxy go back to Kiev. So too do the origins of the first Russian state. They're actually in Ukraine. So there is a historical connection there. There's no question. What about religion more currently? Well, there are two things here too. So President Putin has portrayed himself as a champion of Christianity and of so-called traditional values. But what that means in practice is really favoritism for the Russian Orthodox Church. The Russian government recognizes officially that there are four denominations that culturally, historically have roots in Russia. That's Orthodoxy, Islam, Judaism, and Buddhism. But the Orthodox Church really gets benefits, meaning privileges of getting access to land to build churches or to restore churches, getting funds, and so on. Protestant denominations and Catholics are badly mistreated. So defender of Christianity is not really true. What role does the Russian Orthodox Church play? I believe the head, is it Patriarch Kirill? Now I have to remember his name, has come out in favor of the war. There's been a conflict between Russia and Ukraine's churches because the Russian Orthodox hierarchy claimed, what's the word I want? Claimed authority over the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has pushed back. So they've now split, and that didn't sit well with the Orthodox clergy in Moscow. So religion is just another of these elements that's now separating or dividing Russia and Ukraine.
Thank you. I was reading that there are some, or I'm not sure what they're called, parishes or congregations that were under the Russian Orthodox Church who have decided, in light of the Patriarch's support of the war, they are splitting off and joining the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Do you have any sense of how large a movement that is?
That's the first I've heard of it. That's interesting. If they're in Russia, that's dangerous at this point, because the Russian government has really been cracking down very heavily on anybody who objects to the war. In fact, using the word war is forbidden. There's a penalty of up to 15 years in prison. So I wish I knew more about that, but I'd like to find out more. Thanks for raising it.
I have another question here from Denise that says, can you briefly summarize the history of the area that's now called Ukraine, and how Putin uses the argument that they are really one family?
Yeah, it's very long. I mentioned earlier that the earliest Russian state traces its origins actually to Kievan Rus, as it's called, in early centuries AD. And how to describe it? Well, for Putin, Putin claims that because of language and history going back those many centuries, that they're all one people. And there is something to that argument. As I mentioned, the Ukrainian population, roughly 60%, still speak Russian. There is definitely a divide within Ukraine between folks living in the Western part who see themselves as more European, and people in the East who associate or affiliate themselves more with Russia. There's no question, there's a schism there. But Putin's emphasis, Putin has said Ukraine is not a country. It is. Soviet Union broke up, and Putin's denial of this literally reflects refusal to accept that that history has moved on. So I wish I'm not in a position really to talk about the long history between Ukraine and Russia, but for Putin, they really are a single place. And reportedly, the Ukrainian language is viewed in Moscow as just it's bad Russian.
The next question, you've addressed this a little bit, but it's from Kimberly, and she says, what's the latest about the protesters in Russia? Are people still openly protesting?
Some are, but very few. Government has really cracked down very dramatically on people. For me, this looks like what I would call re-Sovietization, actually re-Stalinization. In the course of the war, well, Russia before the war was, as I mentioned, even in 2019, considered to be fully autocratic, authoritarian. It still had, it had government ownership or control over television news, over other media, control over most of the economy, major businesses in the economy, control over, you name it. Putin has established centralized control. The war has brought even more intensive crackdown. The last few, there's a newspaper that was relatively liberal, a radio station that was relatively liberal. They didn't have big audiences. They've been shut down. Social media are basically suspended or driven out of the country. Facebook gone. TikTok, any material from Western countries on TikTok gone. So what happened to protesters? The government has been out in force, arresting people. I don't know if I still have it in the slides, I had a picture of a man in Moscow standing next to, there's a monument to Kiev, part of a monument to different parts of the old Soviet Union and their valor in World War II. He's standing next to a monument that says Kiev. He's standing holding a sign that says, he's not holding a sign, he's holding Lev Tolstoy's War and Peace. He got arrested.
Oh dear. Okay. My apologies because I'm not going to get the pronunciation on this person's name right. Sultram has a couple of questions here. How likely is it that a significant portion of the Russian population might turn against the war? And two, why is the Minsk Accord not useful?
Great. Let me talk about the Minsk Accords first. So there have been two agreements with the title Minsk 1 and 2. The second one was signed. It was a result of mediation by the French and German governments between Russia and Ukraine in 2015 as a ceasefire to bring down the level of hostilities. And the agreement, excuse me, the agreement called for Russia to observe Ukraine's border, for both sides to pull back their heavy weaponry, but it also called for Ukraine to grant autonomy to the two breakaway regions, Luhansk and Donetsk, and to grant an amnesty to all of the officials there. And that the Ukrainian government was supposed to change its constitution to enshrine this autonomy. Well, given that the Russian government was still involved in those two regions, for the Ukraine to grant them autonomy, to give them representation in the Ukrainian central government, legislature and government, that's a Trojan horse. So the Minsk agreements never really got implemented. A few things happened. There have been some exchanges of prisoners, but not much beyond that. The other, I forgot, what was the first question was, oh, popular uprising.
Yes.
Russian government has been pretty good at preempting that. There have been some big demonstrations in Russia since Putin took office. One of the biggest sets of demonstrations occurred in 2011, 2012. 2011 was a parliamentary election and 2012 was a presidential election. It's the one where Putin came back. He had stepped out as president in 2008, and then miraculously came back in 2011 and said, by the way, I'm running again. People took to the streets in protest. And the protests went on for some months. And because the elections were still going on, government was relatively muted in its response. So a lot of people did come out and protest. After he got elected, and the election was not free and fair in 2012, he cracked down. The people who had led the protests got put in jail, put on trial, put in jail. And since 2012, there's been a progressive hardening of controls on civil society. So the odds of people rising up seem to be pretty slim. We don't know, it could happen, there's no question, as it happened in Ukraine twice. But the better odds say that it's the key constituency for Putin that might topple him, and that would be the security services. He's taken great pains to pay them well, to give them privileges, but given that the conduct of the war has gone so badly, and given the fact that he actually arrested some of the intelligence officers, there might be a chance that the security services turn on him. Again, it's a slim chance, but those are the folks with the most power to do it.
Thank you. We have a question from Dale. If Putin is successful in taking over Ukraine, does he have the resources to rebuild the entire country? And what would he do with a rebuilt Ukraine?
Yeah, it's a good question.
There are people who are opposed to the war. Would he be fighting an insurgency?
Yes, yes, he would, especially in the western part of Ukraine. They fought, so some of the very westernmost regions were added to the Soviet Union in the course of World War II. And they fought against Soviet rule into the early 1950s, and they would most likely fight again. I think, well, at the onset of the war, as I mentioned, the Russian government, Putin, anticipated that it would be a short war, and so there wouldn't be as much destruction as we've seen. Once the reality of Ukrainian resistance became obvious, the Russian forces became more destructive. Can Putin afford to rebuild? It's going to depend on a couple of things. One is the continued high price of oil and natural gas, which the Russian government budget depends on pretty heavily. The second is whether sanctions continue. And we should all be watching the French election right now, presidential election, to see what happens, because Marine Le Pen she's gotten funding from Putin, from the Russian government. And there's a very good chance that France then would go against the sanctions, and the whole effort to sort of contain the Russian military would diminish. So there would be Ukrainian resistance, no question. But if the sanctions should diminish and Russia continues to make its revenue from these high oil and gas prices and from other natural resources, then there is a chance. Somebody shared with me, I'll show it to you very briefly. Somebody shared with me a counter from the European Union, from Europe, about how much Russia is still earning from selling oil and gas or fuel resources to Europe. Where is it here? Let me, 1 second. Pull it up. There we go. EU member state spending. That's it. And it keeps going up. $112 a barrel is an amazing amount. When Putin took over, the price was under, it was ranging between $20 and $40 a barrel. This is part of the reason why the Russian government has been able to finance its military modernization. Oil and gas, oil prices shot up.
It seems, to follow up on that, it seems like Russia is threatening to cut off oil and gas to the West unless they pay in rubles. How seriously should the West take that threat?
It's a problem. It's a problem. Although there are still other markets where Russia can sell its resources. China is the biggest one, of course. The one constraint is that Russia still has limited pipeline capacity to China. And so ramping up is not an easy thing to do quickly. As far as Western purchases of Russian energy resources, I guess I haven't followed what's been going on in Germany in particular, and other European countries. I guess this discussion is still going on about whether and when and how they might cut off their own, well, they're looking for alternatives already. Whether they're in a position now to weather a cutoff, I'm not sure.
We have a question here from Pedro that says, how seriously should we take Putin's threat to use tactical nukes?
That one is really hard. They certainly have them. You would want to believe that a rational leader knows that using tactical nukes and wanting to occupy and take over the territory are mutually exclusive. So, our best hope is that he's making rational decisions. Several people have asked or discussed the question of whether Putin is literally in his right mind. And my response so far is, I have colleagues in Moscow who have advised him on domestic issues, on socioeconomic questions, and on policies toward the different ethnic groups. And invariably, they've come away saying he has been well prepared. He has a command of details. He asks good questions. They have a very business-like meeting. So rational decision maker. When it turns to foreign policy, if you follow his speeches and his writings, it's a lot more emotional. And so that's given rise to this question of, how rational is he? I think, I'm going to go out on a limb here. I think still quite rational, but really given to performances of grievances about mistreatment by the West. A long list of grievances. NATO is one of them, but many, many others. The US asked Russia's agreement to have a base in Kyrgyzstan to mount the war in Afghanistan. That's a Russian grievance that just goes on and on. So what looks like the more emotional, irrational part looks like something of a performance, actually. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed that he's rational.
We have a question here from Shameen that says, did you read Lawrence Tribe's opinion piece in the New York Times, in which he argued for using Russian funds that are frozen to support the US efforts to support Ukraine? And if
Good idea.
you did, what's your reaction to that? What would Putin's reaction be to that?
Oh, very negative, no question.
Yeah.
No question. But it's a good idea. I mean, we need to keep supplying both, humanitarian aid and military aid for the Ukrainians. And so, tackling those resources makes sense. I'm not sure what the international law is about that or what precedents there are. So I think I would want to check on that first, though.
From Kimberly, how do you think the war will play out in American politics, specifically the Trump campaign in 2024? And will Russia be supportive of Trump as they were in 2016?
Yeah, that's a question. And it may be that the Russian government's calculus is an expectation that Trump will come back. And so sanctions may hurt in the short term, but might be continued but not enforced, or it just might be lifted. The Russians still make a lot of Trump in their calculus. Still are, shall we say, supportive of him in Russian media and so on. So it's a big question.
Yeah, I want to throw something in. We are the United Nations Association and support the efforts of United Nations, and they're coming under a lot of criticism right now for really not having much effect with peacekeeping efforts, which nobody really is. But the UN continues to provide tons and tons of humanitarian relief through shelter, through food, medical supplies, technology, transportation, all those different things, just the kind of hitting a roadblock on peacekeeping. And do you see the UN having any, what can the UN do actually to make a difference in this whole situation? Because Putin's not going to welcome them coming to Moscow.
Yeah, you're right. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe has monitors in Georgia after the 2008 war. So there's an organization that might help. But sending peacekeepers, I think UN and the developed countries, Europe and the US, became more cautious about sending peacekeepers after the wars in Yugoslavia. And the reason is because unarmed peacekeepers were sent in to Bosnia, and they were attacked and actually taken hostage and couldn't prevent some of the carnage there. And the governments involved got much more cautious after that about sending people in. So could they be sent in? It would be wonderful. And here, I don't know enough, I have to say, about whether that requires a vote of the entire UN or just the Security Council. But I guess if it's the Security Council, then Russia and China veto it.
We have a question this time again. Denise, do we know if Putin has groomed a successor? Does he even think about there being a successor?
Yeah, and how to get rid of him. Seriously, one of the key tasks for a personalist ruler like this is to make sure nobody is standing there in the wings and looking too good. When he was considering, so he had a 2-term limit. He ran for president in 2000, ran again in 2004. So in 2008, he had a 2-term limit. He spent some time trying to find a stand-in candidate who would run for president in 2008, but not be an independent. And he did that. He appointed his chief of staff, I guess, deputy prime minister. That was Dmitry Medvedev. And then Putin came back in 2012. There has been some speculation about who might be able to command some legitimacy in Moscow. One possibility, the mayor of Moscow has a reputation for having built up the city. It's gorgeous, sort of rebuilt parks and roads and museums. It's really a show place, or at least it was the last time I was able to visit. But seriously, Putin had another candidate in 2008 who was actually more qualified, and Putin vetoed that. So yeah, the trick is to keep people guessing and not to have any particulars, and also to play subordinates against each other, especially like the security services, so they don't gang up.
We have someone who's suggesting that you revisit your last slide and address some of those questions.
Okay, we can do that. All right. So I had a couple. One was, how has the Russian government portrayed the conflict to its domestic audience? For the most part, I've watched some of the news coverage and some talk show coverage of the main Russian TV station. It's a government TV station. And the conflict, first, it cannot be described as a war. They're literally, legally not allowed to use the word war. Second, it's portrayed to the Russians as a humanitarian mission to protect people in the eastern regions in Donetsk and Luhansk from an unprovoked attack by the Nazi/fascist Ukrainian government. When you see reports that surveys are showing Russian popular support for the war, partly that's because of the way this is portrayed, and bear in mind that people mostly get their news from domestic sources there. Second, problems with the Russian military planning and implementation, a lot. First was the expectation that there would be a short and easy conflict, which turned out not to be true. Second, different units from different branches of the security services were sent in. I guess more professional special forces sent in from the south, but from the north, military units that had a large percentage of draftees or conscripts who hadn't been prepared for war, didn't know where they were going when they got sent in, and didn't do too well, as we know. The equipment, they had equipment failures for a variety of reasons. Logistics turns out to have been a massive problem. The Russian military modernization has gone on now for about 14 years, since 2008 in the Putin era, and has focused a lot on new high-tech weapons, but hasn't done as well with the sort of fighting on the ground, like logistics, supplying the troops, making sure that the logistics, the fuel and the supplies and so on are accompanying and set up in a way to keep the military served as they're moving into Ukraine. So there's a whole host of those problems. And as I mentioned earlier, just a problem with the initial intelligence, with the intelligence services believing that this would be a cakewalk, turned out to be anything but. Implications for other post-Soviet countries, not good. So Moldova, which is to the west of Ukraine, is officially neutral. It has never, the Moldovan government has never requested or sought any kind of membership with NATO. That hasn't stopped the Russian government from putting pressure on it, because Moldova has sought closer ties to the EU. And so if Russian forces make it all the way across Ukraine's southern border, let me go back here to the map. If Russian forces get as far as Odessa here, they're going to put a lot of pressure on Moldova. And as I mentioned, Moldova already has a territorial conflict along its eastern border. That's one. The other is pressure on the Baltic states, where Putin has claimed that those countries became independent illegally, those countries are run by Nazis and fascists and so on. Why Nazi and fascist is such a terrible thing to say for the Russian public is that, well, the Soviet Union suffered tremendously in World War II, no question about it. The Soviet government after World War II replayed the war on television and in the media repeatedly for years and years, pretty much up until the end, until 1991. Documentaries about the siege of Leningrad, documentaries about Stalingrad, and so on and so forth. In the 1990s, that emphasis on the Soviet victory in World War II somewhat went away. Putin has restored it, tremendously restored it, a lot of emphasis on the Russian victory in World War II. So the war is still pretty salient in the media. And this is especially emphasized in schools. So kids get a big dose of it. And that's why calling the Ukrainian government or the Estonians or Latvians fascist actually resonates with the Russian public. Other questions?
I don't know if this sort of falls outside of your area, but with Finland and Sweden talking about joining NATO, what are the implications of that? Obviously, Putin doesn't approve, but how does that change the military sort of posture of Russia along the border of NATO?
It suggests even more conventional troops. And I believe President Putin has said he would move nuclear weapons into, so Russia has an outpost, an exclave, Kaliningrad, that's not connected to the Russian mainland, and it is heavily armed already. And I guess it's very close to, I have to go back and look at the map. So it's very close to Scandinavia. So he's threatening to put nuclear weapons there. Well, the other part of this is that the Russian government had been sending military planes into Swedish airspace, I don't know about Finland, unannounced, and sending subs into Swedish territorial waters unannounced. And so this has been, the tensions have been boiling for a long time. The war in Ukraine seems to have ramped them up pretty substantially.
Kimberly has a question. Do you think we've heard the truth about Russia and Chernobyl?
I think so. It's been studied, pretty heavily documented about operator mistakes and poor design, I guess, given what we know now. So I think so. This is not an area that part of my expertise. So I think that's the best I can say. I was stunned that the Russian forces were going into the area, apparently without much protective gear.
I don't want to I have so many questions. I could keep you here all night. So please say you're ready to call it quits anytime.
Let's say 7:20, 7 minutes.
Yeah, we're about quarter after.
Okay.
Okay, we'll go to 20 after. That sounds good.
Okay, sounds good. With Turkey a member of NATO, and yet there's been a close relationship between Erdogan and Putin, do you have any sense of how that's going to play out long term?
I've been wondering. And again, this is something that I'm not really very familiar with, but I've been wondering how this works because Turkey, well, countries joining NATO are supposed to be democratic. So much for that argument in the Turkish case or in the case of Poland and Hungary. So I've been wondering about that, about sharing of military intelligence, for example. Erdogan seems definitely to be striking out on a much more independent foreign policy. So I wish I had better information, but just don't know enough about that.
And how do you see the discussion about Putin and war crimes playing out? And is that getting any play in Russia as far as you're aware?
I haven't seen it. I'm sure there must be some discussion of it, if only to react violently against it. It's a question, partly because Russia isn't a signatory, I think, to the International Criminal Court, and partly because he'd have to leave the country and be in a place where he could actually be picked up and put on trial. So whether he would ever come to trial seems to be unlikely at this point. That the evidence seems to be gathering pretty substantially. The difficulty in cases like this in prosecuting a leader is always leaders have subordinates to do the dirty work. It's the triggermen who can be identified easily, right? Or more easily. It's very hard to establish that the actual leader gave the actual order. And that's what's needed in order to convict. In Yugoslavia, for example, Serbian President Milosevic was put on trial. There was a special UN tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s up through, I think it was 2016. And it had been difficult there to find the evidence that he had personally given orders. He passed away before the tribunal ever reached a verdict, but that court did manage to convict some of the commanders among Bosnian Serbs. So is Putin likely to be put on trial? Probably not.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? Feel free to raise your hand and I will unmute you. If you'd rather speak than type.
Okay. We good then? Oh, Denise, I see a hand go up. Can we unmute Denise? Or can she unmute herself?
There
you go.
Speaking about the war crimes, did I hear that a lot of the when they realized it wasn't going to be a cakewalk, I like that term that you used. Did I hear that there were suspicions that they were bringing in soldiers from some of those Central Asian countries to do their dirty work for them as they were pulling out, and that a lot of the war crimes are more likely to be associated with some of those more likely to commit crimes, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Do you think there's any connection there to, was that true that they were bringing in soldiers from other parts? They were being conscripted, basically.
There have been stories about that, but it seems that the ethnic Russian soldiers had been involved too. This is very much like what happened in Eastern Europe at the end of and after World War II, when Russian forces were moving westward toward Germany. A fair amount of brutality. There had been. There was a Chechen, I don't know if we'd call it a battalion, group of Chechen fighters who have a reputation for being particularly brutal. Some Chechen fighters, for example, had gone and volunteered in Syria and were known as really quite nasty types. But reportedly, the Chechen fighters were supposed to go and assassinate Zelensky and didn't make it. And reportedly, the leader of the Chechen region in Russia claimed that he had gone with them, and it turned out he hadn't. So that's as much as I know about sort of non-ethnic Russians being involved.
But in going back to that word brutality, I guess the reason I wonder about that is okay, Putin has, sort of ginned up the hatred by calling them Nazis and fascists. And there, oh boy, might be a little bit of fake news going on over there in Russia too that would get these soldiers, very upset. I mean, it just seems so incredibly brutal, especially to children and to, throwing people down wells, and the atrocities have just been horrific. And I just find it hard, if we are common countrymen, where's that coming from?
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Partly it's well, there are a lot of different arguments about what prompts this kind of behavior. And one of them is that the military culture is particularly brutal. Hazing, for example, has actually resulted in, of new recruits, has actually resulted in severe injury and even death. And so they're just treated badly. But there's another element to this too, and that is how the commanders and the officers behave, and what kind of discipline they enforce on their men. And to the extent that they condone this, or at least look through their fingers to ignore it, that's an issue too. So it's partly they got thrown in. Some of them got thrown in. A lot of them got thrown into a conflict they didn't even know was going to happen. But partly it's also the officers, the commanders, who should be exerting more control, shall we say, over the troops.
The culture.
Culture.
Thank you so much. It was a wonderful presentation.
Yes.
Thank you.
I guess I'll kind of end it with one question. Do you think this is gonna, kind of crazy question, do you think it can end soon? And what would make Putin stop the invasion now? And what would he accept as kind of a trade-off to get out of the country?
Well, my predictive abilities are pretty limited, because I thought this would be a repeat of the war in Georgia, where there was a war, relatively short. The Russians took some territory and then withdrew, and it's not happening. I just don't know. What I would worry about, let me go back to this map here for a minute. What I would worry about is that Putin's goal now is to go all the way across the southern border of Ukraine. That pretty much cuts off Ukraine's export capacity, cuts off its access to water, and that's massive. The Russians have already bottled up the Sea of Azov with this bridge that they built across between Crimea and Russia. Cutting off the rest of Ukraine's ability to trade would be massive. So it's a way to potentially starve out the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian population. Where might he stop? Depends on his ability to keep financing and keep sending in troops. There was a call up for new conscripts on April 1st, supposed to be 130,000 people. I haven't seen yet if that's actually turned up the requisite number or not. But if not, that could be a telling place where Putin is going to have to come to some sort of partial resolution. Most likely by partitioning Ukraine. He's going to take the eastern regions, Luhansk and Donetsk.
Okay. Well, again, thank you again. I always love listening to people who are intelligent and well informed, and you hit both. I'm getting lots of comments from people about what a great presentation it was. So we have recorded it. We'll make it available, if that's okay with you, on our YouTube, Facebook, and our website. To share with others who couldn't join us tonight. And for everyone else, thank you for joining us. We are the United Nations Association chapter of Center County. We're looking to change our name to be more inclusive and go to Central Pennsylvania, because we have members not just in Center County. And as I said earlier, we're always looking for additional members to serve on our board or just to join us. We'll have a follow-up email asking you for comments on this evening's program and other things you'd like to see us do. And so you'll get a follow-up email, or you can just Google us, United Nations Association of Center County, to get more information. Again, I really appreciate everyone joining, and thank you again, Donna. It was a great presentation.
Thanks. A lot of great questions. I really appreciate the chance to talk with everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody. Thank you so much.
Good night.